Turn, please, to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Sometime last year, an American congresswoman found herself in an awkward situation when she mentioned at a prayer breakfast that she was running late for the event because her fiancé wanted to have sex that morning. From her public admission, it was clear that the woman and her fiancé were living together and were in a sexual relationship. What was also clear is that the woman, a professing Christian at an evangelical church with her pastor in the audience, didn't realize she had said or done anything wrong. She mentioned her reason for being late with a smile and with a chuckling assurance to her fiancé that she would see him in the evening, that he wouldn't have to wait long for his desires to be fulfilled. I mentioned this story of this congresswoman not to pick on this particular politician, but to illustrate the reality that sexual immorality, even for many Christians, has lost any sense of stigma. Watch almost any television show or any movie that involves dating or romance, and you'll find that sexual activity between non-married persons is completely normal and utterly pervasive. Christians may still get upset when the culture pushes an LGBTQ agenda, but most of those same Christians won't even notice when popular songs, shows, videos, or movies routinely show, describe, or assume some type of sexual immorality. Years ago, David Wells wrote this: "Worldliness is whatever makes sin look normal and righteousness look strange." Worldliness is whatever makes sin look normal and righteousness look strange. The routine acceptance of sexual immorality is one of the clearest signs of the worldliness of our age. As Christians, we have to be clear on what God has said to us about this topic. We need to regain our sexual bearings. This is the second of 4 sermons I'm preaching on the Christian sex ethic. Part 3 will be March 10th, and part 4 after Easter. The Christian sex ethic is a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, so it'll take some time to put this together. We started last week. Now, I'm going to say, if you were not here last week or you did not listen or watch to last week's message, please go do that. You can do that very easily through our app, because all 4 of these messages should really be grouped together. We're going to keep working on our puzzle today. We put some pieces together last week. We're going to put some more together today. And because this passage is short, we're going to do a Bible study first. I'm going to walk through each verse, make sure you understand what it's saying, and then I'm going to finish with 3 points of application, okay? Let's look at it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now, this is the first of 5 instances in this letter where Paul will refer to something they asked about or wrote about in their correspondence with him. Keep in mind, the Apostle Paul has had a relationship with this church. There's been a back and forth of letter writing going on. Church in Corinth, modern day Greece, Paul writing back and forth. This is the first instance in the letter where Paul is addressing something they've brought up. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, Paul says. So they brought this up. They brought it up. There were questions, there were controversies, or both, and Paul takes time to address this. This statement in quotes is what the Corinthians were dealing with, wrestling with, asking about. Perhaps it's another slogan they have, looking back from last week. When you look at it, is it true? It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, we'll see in due course. The answer to that is, well, it depends. It's true if it refers to extramarital sex, but it is false if it refers to the unselfish marital sex that God commands in the following verses. Now, a question people always ask when they get to this verse is, why were they saying this? Why was this a thing? What's going on? Well, we can only speculate on the motive for this. We can only speculate on the motive. We don't have a motive in the text. Perhaps we could surmise that maybe some of the Corinthian congregation, some of them were ascetics with a faulty view of the body. Maybe that's one reason. Some may have thought that abstinence with one's spouse would serve as an effective contraceptive and the pursuit of extramarital sex, a reasonable substitute. We don't know exactly why this statement is something some of them were living by. We don't really need to know why, because clearly in the verses that follow, Paul believes he addresses it. So we may not know the question, but we do know the answer. Verse 2, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. In this text, sexual immorality is actually plural. The original language is plural, sexual immoralities. There are numerous types of sexual immoralities to be aware of: prostitution, premarital sex, adultery, homosexual sex, etc. Now, it's understandable why someone might look at what Paul says and conclude he's got a very low view of marriage, as if marriage is a concession. Since you can't control yourselves, you might as well get married. That in this context might be an ancillary point. He actually gets onto this in the next section of text and is a little more specific with it. In this particular context, it might be an ancillary point, but I don't think that's the focus of Paul's take. Why? Well, let's look at it. Now, look at the verse again, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman, the verb is implied, should have her own husband. To have is a Greek idiom for to have sexually. So if you were to take this grammatical construction, Bible study, if we were to take this grammatical construction and pull up the LXX Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, but you had people who became aware of the Jewish faith who had no background in Hebrew, so what did they do? Translate into Greek. So now everybody's got access to it. The LXX Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. You were to take Paul's construction to have and look that up in the LXX, the Greek translation of the Old Bible, you realize, it's an idiom for sex. You find it in Exodus 2, Deuteronomy 28, Isaiah 13. So Paul is not arguing why marriage is advisable. He's arguing why it's inadvisable for married partners to withdraw from conjugal relations. Each man should have sex with his own wife. Each woman should have sex with her own husband. That's the verse. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Just in case it needs to be said, conjugal rights means share sex with one's spouse. This word rights means duty or obligation. These duties or obligations come part and parcel with marriage. One of the things, if you're not married but want to be, or you're dating and engaged or looking forward to, make sure before you get married, you know what obligations the marriage commits you to. And then Paul addresses bodily authority. Each spouse's body belongs to the other. We can hear an echo of that in Song of Solomon, an entire book devoted to marital intimacy. The writer says, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Now, what Paul says about the wife here was not controversial in this day. First century Corinth, not controversial. She should allow sex with her husband because her husband has authority over her body. She has a marital duty to meet his sexual needs. That would not have been controversial to the Corinthians. But what Paul says about the husband was shockingly countercultural. He's saying a husband likewise has a marital duty to his wife to meet her sexual needs because his wife has authority over his body. That would have been radically countercultural in first century Corinth. And it's a good reminder to us that the Christian sex ethic, wherever it goes, is going to collide with cultural values. At some point, it's going to collide. It's going to hit up against some aspect of the culture's belief about sex where the people hearing it or learning about it for the first time are going to say, really? That's what the Christian sex ethic is? Undoubtedly, secular people, the pagan people of the first century, when they were to read that, what Paul has to say about this mutual authority each has over the other, they would say, what? Really? Because it didn't work that way. It didn't work that way. And this is one instance where the Christian sex ethic was radically dignifying for women. Because in Roman culture, it did not go both ways. And notice the angle that Paul takes. Notice Paul's emphasis is not on you owe me. Notice his take is I owe you. Notice the way it goes. It's not you owe me, it's I owe you. More on that later. Verse 5, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Since a husband and wife should regularly enjoy sex exclusively with each other, they should not rob each other of it. Neither spouse should hold back from the other. Paul, just in case you're keeping track at home, is not a puritanical prude. He's an early writer of sheet music, maybe the first. But he does have a general exception to this rule. If a husband and wife are going to abstain from sex, there are 4 conditions that need to be met. By agreement, it's in the text, by agreement, they both must agree to abstain for a limited time. The abstaining period needs to be short, not an indefinite period. That you may devote yourselves to prayer. So the purpose of this is to focus on one's relationship with the Lord. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So there's only one relationship that displaces the sexual relationship between a husband and wife, and that is the wife's relationship to the Lord. When time is devoted to that, then sex can be displaced for an indefinite period of time. But notice also that there's only one thing that can displace it. There's only one other pursuit in life that can displace, for a short period of time, the sexual relationship between a husband and wife. What does that say? What is Paul intimating about sex itself? It's more profound than we think it is. I'm going to go into that deeply March 10th. Verse 6, now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So the concession that Paul mentions here is likely temporary sexual abstinence by mutual consent at set times for prayer. So Paul qualifies verse 5. He's not saying that's a command. Not saying verse 5 is a command, but he's saying it's a concession. And then in verse 7, he refers to his own gift of celibacy, that singular gift of freedom from the desire or need of sexual fulfillment that made it possible for him to live without the need for marriage at all. But notice he recognizes this celibacy as a gracious gift. There's a lot of debate today about the charismata, the charismatic gifts that we'll come into contact with a little later in the book. Spiritual gifts. The word that Paul uses to describe spiritual gifts later in the book is the same word he used to describe the gift that he has here, the gift of singleness and celibacy. But notice how this ends, verse 7, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So in the context, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that sexual life in marriage is the gift of another kind. It's the gift of another kind. Sexual intimacy in marriage is a gift. Now, let me drill down into 3 points of application. The Christian sex ethic is anti-ascetic, anti-hedonistic, and mutually self-giving. We're going to take that Bible study and we're going to flesh out some applications for us. The Christian sex ethic is anti-ascetic, is anti-hedonistic, and it's mutually self-giving. Number 1, it's anti-ascetic. Asceticism is a view of the body that leads to treating the body in undignified ways. In its most extreme form, it leads to a very harsh treatment of the body, where it might, for example, starve the body of food or resist any kind of physical pleasure. Pure ascetics aren't likely to offer you ice cream or a neck rub. Asceticism engages in a ruthless discipline of the body. A picture's worth 1,000 words, a story's worth 10,000. A man by the name of Origen, who lived in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, was an ascetic who castrated himself. You got the picture? It treats the body and even the material world as evil. It sees sex as dirty. A certain type of asceticism may have been behind this Corinthian slogan. In verse 1, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. We do know that ascetics had a stream of thought that said this: the more a man or woman punishes their body in this life, the less God will punish their body in the next. Now that you've got 1 Corinthians 7, 1-7 under your belt, how would you assess asceticism? The Christian sex ethic doesn't seem to advocate for it. Paul is encouraging husbands and wives to give themselves to each other sexually with some sort of frequency, even to the point where Paul is concerned the abstention period might be too long. That sound like asceticism to you? And in his language, he says this sexual gift within marriage the sexual union is a gift. It commends sex within marriage. So the Christian sex ethic certainly is not anti-ascetic. Now, if you want some foundations to this, go back to the Garden of Eden. Picture this paradise that God crafted with meticulous precision and exquisite beauty. Picture the brightly colored flowers, the deep green grasses and trees, the rivers, the lakes, the oceans untouched by pollution, the snow-capped mountains. Picture it. Picture it. Once it was all set, God was able to say of it, this is very good. Then and only then did he introduce Adam and Eve into the picture. It's as if he set this immaculate table with the finest linens, cutlery, glasses, and food. And then he brought Adam and Eve into the dining room and he sat them at their place to enjoy it. If God was an ascetic and wanted us to be as well, he started the entire story of the Bible off on the wrong foot. God is not an ascetic. The Christian sex ethic is anti-ascetic. Second, the Christian sex ethic is anti-hedonistic. Hedonism is the opposite problem of asceticism. Hedonism says, have sex whenever and with whomever you want. This was also an issue in Corinth. We've already noted the prostitute problem within this church. So they had this interesting bifurcation of issues, not unlike churches today. If asceticism and hedonism exist on a spectrum, I'm sure we have people in our church who drift in the ascetic direction, Sex is dirty. The body is a morally evil zone. And I'm sure we've got people who drift in the hedonist direction, have sex whenever you feel like it. And we know that one was an issue in Roman culture. Let me transport you back in time to Rome. A pagan husband in the ancient Roman world would generally sleep with his wife only to procreate, while pursuing sex with concubines and prostitutes for pleasure. Wives, how do you feel about that? Just as a quick side note to that, if you know lost people who would even look at that practice and say, that's all kinds of messed up, you can thank the influence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's the influence of Christianity upon the world. The way Demosthenes allegedly explained the purpose of marriage represents how the Roman culture of Paul's day perceived marriage and sex. Here's what he said. This is what living with a woman as one's wife means: to have children by her and to introduce the sons to the members of the clan and of the deme, which would have been a general name for a subdivision or a suburb of Athens. And to betroth the daughters to husbands as one's own. Mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of our persons, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households. That's how it worked. And Paul comes along and does what to it? That's not the way this is going to work. So just like the Christian sex ethic confronts asceticism, so too it confronts hedonism. Paul draws lines around sexual activity. Each man should have sexual relations with his own wife. Each wife should have sexual relations with her own husband. There it is. What does it mean? Prostitutes are out. Concubines are out. Premarital sex is out. Extramarital sex is out. Adultery is out. Homosexual sex is out. Polygamy is out. Bestiality is out. And a whole host of other things. It's out. Each man should have sexual relations with his own wife. Each wife should have sexual relations with her own husband. The Christian sex ethic is neither ascetic nor hedonistic. Third, the Christian sex ethic is mutually self-giving. This really is the meat of the passage. It's the linchpin, the linchpin of the passage. The linchpin of the previous passage that we looked at last week was what? Glorify God in your body. Glorify God in your body. And by the way, the original text did not have chapters or verse numbers. You just kept reading all the way through. So the last thing you hear before Paul talks about the sexual relationship a husband and wife need to have, the last thing you heard is glorify God in your body. Now here's how sex works in marriage. Huh? Glorify God in your body. Now here's how sex works within marriage. You think he's on to a different topic? No, he's still fleshing it out. This is how you glorify God in your body. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now, the sentiment is culturally radical. Let's be honest about our cultural moment. We do really love to claim our rights. Yes, I have a right, right? One of the unintended consequences of freedom is this radical autonomy that loves to see things come our way. We are more likely to walk around thinking, who or what owes me? Than we are to walk around thinking, what or to whom do I owe? But Paul is saying the Christian sex ethic has a view towards giving more than taking. The Christian sex ethic is saying the default position is, what do I owe? Rather than, what am I owed? The very same structure is conveyed in Paul's instructions to husbands and wives in Ephesians 5. Here's what he says. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Notice the grammar again, and notice the parallel to 1 Corinthians 7. All the attention is placed on what each spouse is to give to the other. There is never any attention given to what each ought to expect to receive. Though it's implied, Paul never pauses to point his finger at it. All the focus is on what each is to give to the other. Over 20 years of being a pastor, I've had a front row seat to watch numerous marriages degenerate into divorce. There are common threads that can be observed in all of them, but one is the sharp turn husbands and wives take in their marriage from giving to taking. It's a massive problem. When each spouse wakes up each morning thinking about how they can serve and give to their spouse, it's going to be a good day. It's going to be a good day. But the sin nature in us has a gravitational pull away from giving towards taking. You understand that? The sin nature in us works like gravity. It wants to move the direction, not from here out, but from out in. What can I get? What can I get? Well, I got news for you. Copernicus called, and you're not the center of the universe. When one or both spouses wake up in the morning thinking about what they aren't getting from the other, it's going to be a tough day. If I was offering a crash course on building and maintaining a healthy marriage, I would say this: ask God for the strength to wake up each morning with a mindset that says, how can I serve my spouse today? What can I give to my spouse today? And don't just gloss over, ask God to give you the strength each morning to do that, because this is a God-sized endeavor. Be able to wake up and ask for that and really execute that is a God-sized endeavor, because it's bucking the natural forces at work in us. All the emphasis in Paul's instructions to us are not on what am I owed, but what do I owe? What am I owed is a horrible question. It's a horrible question. Delete it from your hard drive. Get it out of your vocabulary. What do I owe is the nutrient pivotal to marital flourishing. I'll close with this. The power of self-giving is dramatically portrayed in a true story once shared by Erwin Lutzer, who pastored Moody Church down in Chicago. A woman came to a lawyer and said, I want to get a divorce. I really hate my husband and I want to hurt him. Give me some advice. In addition to wanting to get all the money and stuff and give him the shaft, she was wondering about some other way she might do him in. The attorney said, look, you're going to divorce the guy anyway, so for 3 months, don't criticize him, speak only well of him, build him up. Every time he does something nice, commend him for it, tell him what a great guy he is, and do that for 3 months. After he thinks that he has your confidence and love, hit him with the news and it'll hurt him more. Diabolical. The woman thought, well, I can't go wrong with this. I'm divorcing the guy anyway. Yeah, why not? Why should I speak badly about him? I'm going to do that. I'm going to speak only well of him. So she complimented her husband for everything he did. For 3 months, she told him what a great man he was. And you know what happened to that relationship? After 3 months, they forgot about the divorce and they went on a second honeymoon. True story. That is the radical, upside-down, healing and sustaining power of self-giving. And where do we see the epitome of that? Where do we see the epitome of self-giving? We see it in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The very thing marriage exists to illustrate. Jesus leaves his home in paradise to live in our sin-infested world and subjects himself to all its nastiness. He's treated as a criminal and dies an excruciating and humiliating death. He gives his life. He gives his death. When did he do this? When we were alienated from him and not on good speaking terms. Why did he do this? To make us his bride. A relationship, folks, that will never end in divorce. The gospel shows you the healing and sustaining power of self-giving. And it's my prayer that every marriage in our church will serve as a microcosm of the gospel, wherein one sees the healing and sustaining power of mutual self-giving. May that be true of us. Let's pray. It's no wonder if marriage is the one place, God, where that, above anything else, is supposed to serve the purposes of vividly reenacting the gospel, of portraying the gospel, of illustrating the gospel, of putting the gospel on display. It's no wonder it's target number one for our enemy. Marriage is meant to be a beautiful picture of Jesus and the church. So, Lord, I pray for every marriage here. The mutual self-giving seen in the life, death, the resurrection of Jesus. I pray that would be embodied in every marriage. I pray for those marriages that are struggling. The road is just bumpy. When that happens, the force exerted on us away from giving and towards taking becomes even more powerful. And so I pray that your Spirit would just gently nudge, allow them to see. Winning in the hard times of marriage is not done by taking. Every marriage that's in a tough spot, the winning is not going to come by taking. It's going to be done by reenacting the gospel. It's going to be done by giving. So I pray that you'd make us a church that's filled with that mentality, that conviction, that love, to see the gospel be not just something we believe, but visibly portray in all aspects to our lives. We ask for your help, and we do so in the powerful and strong name of Jesus. Amen.